Hello everyone, this is topic 6, oral and written languages, autonomy, dependency and mutual relationships. Introduction. Traditional grammars solely paid attention to the written language, whereas speech was discarded on the assumption that it was disorganized and featureless. On the opposite end, for some time communicative approaches seemed to deal only with the oral register, leaving the written one aside. This situation no longer holds. Fortunately, modern linguistic analysis has readdressed the balance by paying attention to both spoken and written language. It cannot be ignored that communication takes place both in the form of speech and writing. In this sense, the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages and the companion volume argue that the communicative event can be regarded as the speaking, writing, listening, or reading of a text, and that both speech and writing are legitimate forms of language. Needless to say, both spoken and written languages are forms of the same language. It is the same system underlying them. However, what's important to note is that they exploit different features of the system and gain their power in different ways. These differences and peculiarities are essential in the language classroom, since teachers and students should not aim for the same results and types of behavior in the two mediums. Both the Common European Framework and the official curriculum for official language schools highlight the importance of distinguishing both modes of expression, that is, reading, writing versus speaking and listening, since the teacher needs to be aware of the characteristics of each mode in order to teach learners how to communicate effectively depending on the channel of communication. Differences between spoken and written language. Essentially, it can be said that oral expression is less conceptually dense, closer to our experience, more universal and spontaneous, and less abstract than the written form. Written expression is in turn more conceptually dense, more polished, planned and concentrated. It also tends to be rather more highly coded and more removed from the categories of our experience. Before going any further, it must be highlighted that the differences which are going to be noted after this are best thought of as trends rather than as absolute distinctions. It is therefore very likely that there are a few, if any, absolute differences between speech and writing. This unveils the possibility of interpreting speech and writing as two ends of a single continuum, namely the continuum of communication. Permanence. Spoken language is fleeting, it happens, whereas written language is permanent, it exists. This allows the reader to reread if necessary, but also forces the writer to be more careful about what they write. Complexity. Writing and speech represent different modes of complexity, the most salient difference lying in the nature of clauses. Whereas spoken language tends to have shorter clauses connected by more coordinate conjunctions, writing has longer clauses and more subordination. Also, written language gains its complexity through dense lexical content, while oral speech achieves it through highly complex sentence structure. Physical form. Speech uses the medium of phonic substance, whereas writing uses the medium of graphic substance. Syntactic and grammatical features. Speech usually presents short utterances, usually incomplete. In writing, however, there is a more confident and precise use of grammatical cohesion devices. Grammatical metaphor. They are situations where meanings typically realized by one form get realized by other less typical linguistic choice. Lexical features. Writing places a heavier demand on vocabulary than speaking. In speech, the vocabulary is quite general, with a low degree of explicitness. The written mode, however, makes use of a more precise vocabulary, essentially because it allows for more processing time. There's also a tendency to use Latinisms instead of Anglo-Saxon words. Organizational features. Writing is usually clearly planned, demanding a writer's conformity to conventions like paragraph topics, logical order, preference for non-redundancy and subordination of clauses, etc. Speech, however, lacks these features since it is markedly spontaneous. Speaking of which, spontaneity phenomena. Speech contains spontaneity phenomena such as frequent pauses, interruptions, markers and fillers, while the written text will ideally have all such traces removed. Formality. Speech is intrinsically less formal than writing, which means that students should be allowed to use incomplete utterances, hesitations, false starts, fillers, and so on in their oral contributions. In writing, however, there are fewer contractions and phrasal verbs, and there's an absence of colloquialism and idiomatic language. Graphic or visual features. Speech presents paralinguistic and supralinguistic elements such as facial expressions, gestures, body movements, and proximity. In written language, however, almost the whole burden of the communicative task falls on linguistic elements. Context. Since we're usually in the same place at the same time when talking to each other, our language can partly depend on the context. When it comes to writing, however, it needs to be context independent. Turn-taking monologic organization. The language used in a spoken situation will typically be organized according to the turn-by-turn sequencing of talk. Written language, on the other hand, will be produced as a monologic block. Processing conditions of speech and writing. These conditions make reference to the time factor, and they are of a special relevance in speech. The words are being spoken as they're being decided and as they're being understood. These affect the speaker's ability to plan and organize the message. The speaker's sentences can't be as long or as complex as in writing. We often make syntactic mistakes, we forget things we intended to say, etc. The words are also being spoken as they're being understood. When it comes to listening comprehension, once spoken, they're gone. So these poses a great difficulty for students, since they have to keep up with the speed of the voice. It is the speaker who dominates the interaction and not the listener. In the written mode, however, the writer has more time to plan and organize their message. Equally, the reader can take as much time as they want to reread and check before interpreting the message. Besides, readers can read at their own pace. Reciprocity conditions of speech and writing. A remarkable feature of speech is that it is a reciprocal activity. That is, it offers the possibility of checking the listener's reactions, asking for clarification, reformulating, and so on. This way, to make sure that communication is taking place, speakers have to pay attention to their listeners and adapt the messages accordingly. Besides, speech takes place against a background and has a situational context, which means that many references do not have to be so explicit. In contrast, writing is not a reciprocal activity, and the context has to be created as we write. So this has to be compensated by a greater need for logical organization, greater clarity, and the use of grammatical and stylistic techniques to focus in attention on main points. Besides, the writer has to anticipate the reader's understanding, general knowledge, cultural and literary schemata, and, very importantly, their interpretation. As for readers, they have to interpret language with only the written words themselves acting as contextual clues. They have no way of signaling potential problems to the writer, and this becomes especially thorny when it comes to understanding presuppositions. Readers, therefore, have to put in some compensatory work in order to make their reading successful. 2 dimensions of communication. Communication, whether written or spoken, involves 2 types of skills: productive, including speaking and writing, and receptive interpretative, including listening and reading. At this point, it is important to note that students can generally deal with a higher level of language in receptive than in productive skills. That's the reason why as teachers we should follow the input before output principle. Subskills involved in production, writing and speaking. First, grammatical and lexical skills, grammatical accuracy in terms of syntax and morphology, and also a vocabulary which should be appropriate. Expressive or stylistic skills, which refer to the student's ability to express themselves in a variety of styles or registers. Rhetorical skills, which refer to the student's ability to use linguistic cohesive devices. And organizational skills. Subskills involved in comprehension, reading and listening. Prediction. Efficient listeners or readers predict what they're going to hear or read, that is, they activate the schemata. Scanning. It consists in extracting specific information without paying attention to the text as a whole. On the contrary, skimming is the reader's ability to get the general message, discarding what's not essential or relevant. Recognizing functions and discourse patterns, so for example, introduces an instance of something and, in other words, is followed by a reformulation of what has been said before, etc. Deducing meaning from context, distinguishing between literal and implied meanings, and tolerating ambiguity. Speech and writing, complementary in nature. According to Halliday, a language is a system of meanings encoded through a network of expression. In this sense, writing and speech are different modes for expressing linguistic meanings, that is, two ways of saying things. Still, it's worth asking, can we say that talking and writing are different ways of expressing the same meanings? The answer is both yes and no. Yes, in the sense that the two are alternative outputs, alternative realizations of the meaning potential of language. But at the same time, we should recognize that there are specific senses in which the answer must be no. First of all, because writing does not incorporate all the meaning potential of speech. It leaves out the prosodic and paralinguistic contributions. Second of all, speech and writing are in practice used in different contexts and for different purposes, though obviously with a certain amount of overlap. And third, speech and writing impose different greeds and experience. There's a sense in which they create different realities. It's as if writing created a world of things, whereas talking created a world of happenings. In conclusion, it is important to note that neither speech nor writing is superior or better in any way. They are two complementary modes of expression, both necessary in communication. Still, the position of functional grammars in this respect is worth mentioning, since they maintain that the study of oral speech is much more richly developed and more fully revealed than the written language. The reason for these statements, it is claimed, lies in the fact that spoken language is largely unconscious and spontaneous, therefore showing a grammatical and semantic variation which is hardly ever attained in writing. Be that as it may, the truth is that in a literate society, the functions of language are shared between speaking and writing. As far as learning is concerned, it can't be forgotten that there are different worldviews embodied in speech and writing. But from the learner's point of view, reading and writing and listening and speaking are different ways of learning because there are different ways of knowing. The written language presents a synoptic view. It defines its universe as a product rather than as a process. It is a thing that exists. The spoken language, however, presents a dynamic view. It defines its universe primarily as a process, encoding it not as a structure but as constructing. In spoken language, phenomena do not exist, they happen. A final note should be made to the fact that although the special features of each variety clearly derive in the first place from the medium, once it has evolved, the variety becomes independent of the medium and can be transposed into the other form. In other words, if the written text was read aloud, like in this case, it would still have the effect of a piece of written language, for example a lecture. Similarly, spoken language is spoken language even if it's presented to us in the form of a transcription, for example a dialogue. To end with, it goes without saying that skills have to be integrated in the classroom in the same way as they are in real life. In the particular case of oral skills, many authors coincide that in order to take active part in a conversation, you need to be both a good listener and a good speaker. Therefore, we should not stick to the traditional format of speaking after listening, but rather involve the students in an active conversation where they are the speakers and also the listeners. In the case of writing skills, note that reading texts provide very good models for English writing. This is of the utmost importance, since when teaching writing, students need to be shown what they are being encouraged to do. Thank you so much for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, whatever, and feel free to check out the other topics. Thank you.